Good morning, and thank you very much to Medidata for inviting me to talk about one of my most favourite subjects. I'm going to talk about disruption, but I should just qualify this by saying that I'm making a difficult transition from being an external, where I'm paid to ask difficult questions, to somebody who's internal and still expects to ask the same difficult questions. 6 months' time, it doesn't quite work out. So I work in technology and information, late stage development. We're a team of about 30, headed by Anna Craig, and I've been pleased to say that any views expressed are those of my employer. So, through where we're going with this. So my interest in disruption is very much based on my past experience. So I spent 4 years at Rock. So in the scheme, a new person, as long as possible, my perspective on how things actually work. Disruption at work. See, we started late and now we've got a microphone. Excellent. So the ability to maintain an external perspective is incredibly difficult. And we were talking about acronyms last night, and I'm getting well versed in acronyms, so maybe it's time I need to go for some special treatment to get around that. The previous 10 years I spent in consultancy and spent a lot of work in early .com territory, a lot of time around the music industry, satellite, media, and also spent 7 years working with NICE in the UK, and that's where I got my background in life sciences. And learned a lot of very interesting things around disruption at that particular point. So before that, spent 10 years in academia. That's where the disruption actually started. In a business school, in an arts university, which are two things which don't necessarily go very well together. But we worked with a lot of really interesting clients during that period. Prior to that, I used to organise large-scale events for the Vatican, so you can probably tell a slightly holy aura about me. And prior to that, I was a musician in the Royal Marines. So I've had a very varied background, but it's characterised by not actually belonging to the system yet, which is something I'm also trying to fight off as much as possible. So let's just talk about innovation to disruption. And disruption is one of these very interesting things. It's also quite hyped. We must be disruptive, we must be innovative, we must change. Oh yes, I'll do that before my next end of year appraisal. But there's a lot of forces at play here. So we are being disrupted, but I'm suggesting that we need to try and disrupt ourselves to make sure that we serve our organisations to best effect. So innovation is difficult, very difficult to do, especially if we don't actually have to. And there's also a midpoint here where we just do things which are new, but just an iteration of what we previously had. But by far the most difficult thing of all is to change everything and produce something which is new. Not just to be disruptive, but to do something which is different. So think about this. When's the last time you actually watched a scheduled television programme? I have an 8-year-old daughter who knows nothing about scheduled programmes. I mean, that's not a big thing in life, I take it, but it's all on demand, it's YouTube. The whole model for broadcast has changed completely. When's the last time you bought any music? Haven't bought any music for ages. So there's a whole load of things which have really changed quite dynamically around us. But in life sciences, we've been protected to a large extent. We've got our regulators, we've got patient safety, we've got significant barriers to entry for external applicants. But that's not going to save us. My talk is not about suggesting that life sciences is going to get disrupted and disappear tomorrow, but I'm actually suggesting that some of the things we've heard about today, from Glenn in particular, a lot of stuff is changes, new opportunities, but we have to change ourselves to make the most of those. And around disruptions, a couple of points I want to make. So during my consultancy phase, there were two things which stand out in my mind around complexity and complication. Complicated is very difficult to do. So the most mind-blowing project I ever worked on was program management for satellite design. I thought my head was going to burst. I knew nothing about this at all, and it was incredibly complicated. And trying to persuade people to do complicated things in the same way was really quite difficult. Complex is a whole range of parts that move, and you don't always get the same result. Understanding the way a pre-teenage girl thinks was complex. And this was in the music industry, where we're trying to understand fan bases, how they communicated with each other, how they reacted to bands, and so on. Now, clearly, I didn't get them uncracked because I'm not on a yacht in the West Indies somewhere, I'm talking to you. But that was really, really quite fascinating. But we had to start from the point where, I mean, clearly, I've never been a pre-teenage girl. You don't look very convinced, but I haven't. And so trying to think in the way that somebody else thinks, which is totally alien to you, is incredibly difficult to do. And you have to have a very open mind. And this is a really interesting job where I was probably 10 years older than the press officers and the people who ran the bands. So they were early 20s, I was in my 30s. The people who owned the record labels were aging rockers, you know, think Ozzy Osbourne, who were quite disconnected from most things, but particularly from this generation. So there were about 3 generation gaps, all having the same conversation about the same thing, but in incredibly different ways. And it was absolutely fascinating. But it also sets us up for what's coming in our direction. So my presentation this morning is about you and me. It's about how we might need to think differently so that we make sure that the technology and the data and the information that's required by our colleagues and our organizations is fit for purpose tomorrow, not today. So I'll be laying out a couple of challenges for you to think about in terms of how we work. I'm going to say that changing yourself is one of the most incredibly difficult things to do. And we'll do a little lie detector test on you shortly just to see how you fare on that. So let me kick off with a question. Anybody in the room own an electric car? Hybrid, that will do, yeah. Okay, so we've got a few people who are not killing the polar bears. So I want to start off by talking about disruption outside of life science completely and look at a different sector. So let's talk about electric cars. So at my next bonus, I won't be getting one of these, sadly. So this is a Tesla. It's a really fantastic high-end car. I was at a conference a while ago with one of the guys from Tesla in the UK. Got to sit in it, touch it. It's like a schoolboy, being really excited about it. It's an amazing piece of equipment. And of course, it's run on electric and a big bank balance too. So here's a scenario. At the weekend, I was waiting in line in my Ford to get some diesel at a gas station. And gas stations have changed quite a lot over the period of time. So in the UK and probably everywhere else, they're not really gas stations anymore, mostly. They're mini supermarkets. You can pop in, get a coffee, get a pastry. You can do your shopping, all sorts of stuff, while you're blocking the pump that somebody who wants to buy some fuel is waiting for. So the person in front of me had obviously gone in to do 2 weeks' worth of shopping. And I was sitting there thinking, come on, this is taking forever. Not enough pumps. And out the corner of my eye, I could see this dream car, this Tesla, who clearly was not queuing up for diesel or any other kind of fuel for their car, but fuel for themselves. So they parked up, they were probably getting a cappuccino, a croissant, and just laughing at everybody else, filling up their dirty cars with dirty fuel. I felt envious. But actually, it got me thinking about the disruption caused by electric cars. So electric cars have been around since the 1800s. It's only the last few years, Tesla, some of the other manufacturers have started to produce cars, and now governments are mandating that by a certain point, we will all have to be electric. So in the UK, there's some kind of distant point. But I was thinking, while I was waiting a long time, how the business model for gas stations is going to change over time. How a lot of business models are going to change if electric cars become the norm. So at the moment, I understand it takes about 30 minutes to charge your car up if we do one of these kind of rapid things. So let's suppose that 30 minutes stays the norm, which it probably won't. So in years to come, what's going to happen? I won't go to a gas station because I don't need gas. So I could top up my electricity at home overnight, but that's going to cost me money. So where am I going to go? So I might go to Starbucks. Starbucks might say, if you spend $10 on coffees, we'll give you a half an hour's worth of electricity. Supermarkets might also say, spend over this amount of money, and you'll get your free electricity. So it's going to change the dynamic of so many things. And that is truly disruptive if it all comes to pass. And nobody's in control of that. So the real smart players will be looking at the roofs of their massive supermarkets or their shopping malls thinking, great, solar panels, wind vanes, let's start getting ready. So when electric cars become more prevalent, we can start to say to people, come and spend your half an hour with us. We'll give you free electricity. Meantime, of course, you would have spent about $100 It's like going to a DIY store for a packet of screws. You come out with wood and hundreds of dollars worth of stuff. So that's going to change quite radically the business model all round. But what is the business model? So disruptive technologies bring about different business models to those that exist currently. And this is the trick to try and work out, so what is providing value within this new business model? So within electric car territory, I wonder where the value lies and where the business model sits. So is it the car? Possibly not. What else is it that provides the model? So I think it's the battery. Because the battery dictates how long you can drive your car for. People I know back in the UK who drive electric cars have range fear. So one of the guys I work with has got a Volkswagen Golf. It's a lovely car. I said to him, how is it? He said, I'm glad I live locally. So the range advertises, 80 miles or something. He lives in Welling, 5 miles from the office. He struggles. Nobody from Volkswagen here, is there? Or your lawyers? He struggles to get into work on electric, especially in the cold weather. We've had snow in the UK recently, which is not a usual thing. He struggles to get into work. So the battery, I think, is going to be the key thing, and powering the battery will be the key driver for a new business model for electric cars. I'm making this up, but it makes sense. You can tell how long I spent in the queue at the weekend thinking about this. So that's quite a radical difference, and I make a big change to a whole range of people. So the value will not come from the car itself, but the value will come from getting people to spend their time with you while they charge their car. So Starbucks, shopping malls, other places. I think probably charging points would be quite prevalent, and that is where the value is going to perhaps be later on. There's also a challenge here, because incumbents don't pay much attention to the people swimming around them. So clearly this is not about electric cars, the same kind of principle. So I think for a long time, some of the big gas manufacturers didn't take much notice of solar, alternative energies. They're starting to get more and more interested in that now, because they can see their old business model is going to disappear over time, quite possibly. And Netflix and Blockbuster is a great example of this, where Netflix was circling Blockbuster and others for quite some time. And they were small. It wasn't the main market that Blockbuster were interested in. They started to chip away at it. But the nature of disruption, it creates new markets from what exists. It goes for the small stuff. And then the small stuff starts to grow into big stuff. And then before you know it, the model's completely disappeared. So I watch Netflix. I stream stuff. I don't buy music anymore, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So advertisers trying to get to me are going to be a bit hard pushed. So the whole business model around a whole series of things has changed quite considerably in that period of time. And there's some interesting lessons for us in life sciences around this. And again, I'm not suggesting any of us will disappear overnight, but we have to keep evolving, we have to disrupt, and it's not just the external stuff. So I don't know about any of you, but I'm not personally in a position to disrupt the way that Roche works externally. We've got senior people doing that very thing. So some of our recent acquisitions tell you some of the direction and the thinking of senior leadership. But I am in a position to disrupt internally, to do my part to make sure the organisation can deliver what we need to do for the next generation of patients and technology. So disruption is destructive, but also creative. So let's think about life sciences. And what's the business model? So you could say currently the business model is about selling drugs to patients. That's where we make our money. Getting to that point is colossally expensive, and it's not sustainable. We've already heard several times today people talking about fewer patients, more targeting required. It's more difficult to run trials in the traditional way. So what's the business model going to be in the future? Is it about selling drugs to patients? I wonder. Or is it something else in the value chain that people will pick up on to say, actually, this is quite an interesting one? So coming back to my earlier point, and my challenge to myself and to you is to think about how do we change to make sure we're in the right position to disrupt. And one of the key things that I'm most interested in is the change from inputs to outputs. So payment by results. So we pay many providers if our drugs make a difference to their patients. And that changes a lot of things in terms of how we work. It changes the dynamic of some of our relationships, and also changes our thinking. But that's about the science, that's about the drug. So what about applying that to us and thinking about how we work? So if you're a data manager or a technologist or somebody else working in this space, think about that. Inputs, outputs. How does that change the way that we look at things? So I'm suggesting, again, not that any of us are going to disappear anytime soon, but I think there are some big shifts around in terms of the business model. Where does the value come from? Is it about the sale of a drug to a patient, particularly if we are being paid if that drug makes a difference to them? Prolonging life, increasing life quality, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the key things, and this is my major thing, it's not just about the technology. It's about the people, and it's also about economics too. So we can have the shiniest toys there are. And just last week, I had a demonstration from somebody from a well-known organisation trying to convince me and others that this excellent tool would actually predict all these great things around planning a study. Trouble is, I can say with some confidence that most people in the organisation would not want to use it, because we're not at that point where people are happy to have a machine tell them what to do. Just a cultural thing. I think that applies to many organisations. So regardless of all the shiny toys we've got, we still need to get people to think differently and act differently to use this stuff. Otherwise, we'll spend millions on things that people are not going to use. And maybe we've had a lot of experience of doing that already. But as I already mentioned, changing yourself is incredibly difficult to do. Changing your organisation is even more difficult to do. That's what we have to do. And the trouble with all of this is that, at the moment, this is voluntary change. So I need to think about doing things differently to get ready for the future. Oh, I'll do that next week. There's no compulsion to do it now. It's not as though there's some burning platform. If we don't change, we won't have a job in a month's time. Okay, I'm going to get interested. So this is all about really challenging our professionalism, our expertise, our motivation to try and work out what do we do right now that adds value and how that might change over a period of time to produce an even better result. So here's the lie detector test. So let's suppose you go and see your physician. They take a look at you and say, sir, madam, I'm going to strongly suggest you change your lifestyle, otherwise you are going to die within X amount of time. How many of you would go away and change your lifestyle? Glenn didn't put his hand up. So. So, a lot of you are lying. Sorry. So, there's a really interesting concept called immunity to change, and it's about this inbuilt inability to change ourselves. And so some research in the States a while back looked at patients with heart problems, and where the physician said, go away, change your lifestyle, or you will die. 6 in 7 died. And only one of them actually chose to change their lifestyle. So if, and before anybody from the stats department starts asking me about the reliability of that sample set, I'm not even going there. It's just a principle. But it's interesting though, because if we find it so difficult to change ourselves over something so fundamental as the ability to live, what chance have we got when it comes to changing things on a voluntary basis? And this is the really tricky thing to do. So 1 in 7 changing, that's really tricky. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes thinking about how do we work towards changing ourselves. And one of the concepts of immunity to change is that, let's think of end-of-year review. So you've had a 360 appraisal, lots of colleagues and other people have said great, indifferent, bad things about you, and you're sitting there with your manager, you're reviewing this, and they're saying, oh, I really think you need to delegate more. You say, oh yes, okay, so I'm going to delegate more. But you're saying it because they want you to say that. You've never delegated before in the past, so why are you suddenly going to start doing that now? So this is about the inbuilt immunity to change. So we think we have to change, and in big organizations this is really interesting. We're now going to be innovative. We've set up a new innovation department full of people who've been there for 100 years. And the other thing is that we have this other inbuilt immunity, which is around, we've got really good infrastructure in life sciences. We've got pensions, we've got healthcare, we've got childcare vouchers, we've got bonuses, we've got all sorts of stuff. Why do I want to disrupt any of that? And one of the things I really miss about my consultancy days, although I'm happy not to go back to that anytime soon, is the flying by the seat of your pants, the risk-taking that went into that. I worked with a lot of people pre-IPO. So these people were staking everything they had on an idea, which they then wanted to take to the finance guys to say, look, this is what our idea is, could you help us to finance it? And these people put their houses on the line, they put their savings on the line, they put everything they had. And it was, a couple of people, 2 beanbags, a loft apartment, and a dodgy internet connection, and a couple of laptops, taking on some of the big players. And many of them did. Making it for them meant being bought out by the big players, ultimately. But they were taking risks. They were taking massive risks because they wanted to do something which was different to what already existed. So this is one of the key challenges for us, is that how do you get to that particular point of getting around this comfort zone that we've got, and also, many of us are quite far removed from the actual patient. And the other thing I really liked about some of the olden days was you were so close to the action. Remember, early days, online shopping, it was amazing. It was like having a private investigator follow somebody around your website, looking at what they did, how they behaved, when they did things, and you could offer all sorts of incentives and inducements to get them to do something different. Shift an icon, change a price. It was really quite amazing. Sounds manipulative, and it was. That's called marketing. But it was really, really interesting to do. So let's come back to the physician then, and I've got to change myself. So I've gone to my physician for a checkup. I feel fine. Everything works okay. Okay, maybe I've gone up a few trouser sizes since my last visit, but, it's all good. And I'm the same as everybody else I know, type of thing. So the physician will look at me and think, okay, this person is a XYZ waiting to happen based on their past experience. So they're going to say to me, okay, so they'll ask me how much I drink, how much I eat, how much exercise I have, stress levels, sleep, all the usual stuff that you lie about. And they're going to make their own conclusions about this. So the first piece of this is I'm actually not ready to change. Everything's fine. It's great. It's good. So think personal health, think work environment, everything's fine, I'm getting paid, get an incremental pay rise, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no reason for me to change. It's all good. But then there needs to be some sort of trigger, which takes me to the next point, where I actually start getting ready for change. And here's an example. So Uncle Bob is the same kind of physique as me, same kind of genetic makeup, et cetera, et cetera. He looks like me, he's the same size, shape, same approach to life, same drinking habits, and that kind of stuff. And he's out playing golf one day and doesn't come back because he has a heart attack on the golf course. Okay, so that's my trigger. Wake up call. I am Uncle Bob. But he's probably done me a big favour in a quite negative way of providing that wake up call by dying early, because that sends a signal to me saying, actually, unless you get your act together, you're going to be Uncle Bob in a short space of time. Okay, so I'm being slightly flippant and slightly irreverent around this, but you get the message. The same thing applies in the working environment. What's the trigger that's going to drive me to start to think and do things differently when I don't really have to? And I work and have worked in organisations where people have been there for a long time. Oh yeah, we tried this back in 1066. Oh yeah, we've done this before. Oh yeah, okay. And actually they don't want to move because it's fine as it is. They don't want to take risks. So this key part for me is how do you get somebody from not being ready to change to actually be actively thinking about, okay, I need to do something a little bit different. And then the third piece is I'm getting ready now, so I actually understand what it takes. So I understand that if I change my diet, if I go to the gym 3 times a week, if I do all these things, I'm actually setting myself up. But there's a formula, there's a recipe that's going to help me to understand what I need to do differently. And I've got sight of what those outcomes are likely to be. So if you lose X amount of pounds, then you're going to probably live a little bit longer, be happier, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I can see what the future looks like. And then I start to put it into action. So I can see the benefits. Hey, I've been eating bananas and yogurts for weeks. Excellent, I've lost X kilos, I feel better, I've got to buy a new wardrobe, but hey. And so I can actually start to see the results of all of this. And then, of course, that ultimate nirvana is this bit, where my new way of working just becomes the way I do things all the time. I don't have to think about it, it just is. So this is the trans-theoretical change theory, which medical practitioners have used for years, but I'm also trying to deploy it in terms of a business sense. So what is it about what I do in my organisation that could be done differently to produce a better result? That's a key thing to ask. So there's a danger that disruption is stuff that other people do. So our senior leaders at Roche have announced all sorts of really interesting things recently. They're driving that. I can say, yeah, okay, that's interesting. Got nothing to do with me. It is interesting. But actually I'm missing the point, because people like me and people like you in our organisations will have to work differently in future to make some of these other things possible. Otherwise, we won't exist. But it's not just that. It's also a really interesting professional challenge to think about the value that I deliver to my organisation, whether it's technology or data or information or insight or any other thing around that, is how can we actually improve what we do to help the organisation to make full use of these things? So whether we're looking at big data, whether we're looking at more algorithms, whether we're trying to do trials without patients, all that kind of stuff. So what can we do to try and disrupt thinking ourselves? So there's a whole lot of challenges here. Not least is the nature of a disruptor. So I was thinking during the week, who would I say is a disruptor? And it's really interesting, actually, because it was quite a small list of people, mostly male and white. So I didn't show any pictures of that because I'm looking for something a bit more representative across the piece. But a disruptor works in a particular way. So one thing is they are not part of the system. They're very rarely part of the system. And this is where some of the challenges lie. If I've been in the organisation for some time, can I disrupt myself? Yes, you can, but it's a bit harder to get to. And it's thinking about the business model. How do we change the business model? That's a really important thing for us to do. So where do we create value for our own organisations? So here's three things which I thought were pretty interesting. So the first one is we're open. So somebody who is disruptive, as well as being probably from outside the system where they don't really belong, is open to ideas and thoughts that are probably in conflict with their own. And let's face it, we are all biased, including me. That's why I showed you my murky past on one screen, because that shaped my thinking, that's made me who I am, it's about my expectations of things. So if somebody turns around and says to me, actually, you are talking rubbish, you're completely wrong, that's quite a hard thing to take. I'm getting over it, but, you know. But it's really difficult, and a lot of people are not receptive to that. I've got a great idea. This is, oh, God. So that's the first thing, be open to new ways of thinking, open to new ideas. The second piece is around being conscientious. So anybody who's done any kind of assessment of Myers-Briggs or one of the other ones, you know, you're a driver-doer or you're whatever you happen to be, very few people are open to new ideas and creative and actually able to deliver stuff. They're not necessarily the same beast. So this is a bit of a rarity. So I can have some great ideas, but they're never going to move beyond an idea because I actually lack the ability to put them into practice. And this is an important thing about disruptor. Not only do they have the great ideas, but they're also able to put those into action and actually relentlessly keep driving that thing until it happens. That's a rare beast, or two rare beasts, even rare when you put them to one person. And then the third part is they're disagreeable. Not in terms of their personal habits or hygiene, that does sometimes come with the territory, but it's about they don't need other people to agree with them. They're so determined that this thing is going to work that if everybody around them says, you're off your mind, they say, I don't care. I actually know what I'm doing and I'm so determined to push this forward. Now, those are three rare characteristics, even rarer in one person, but there's a way around that as well. So we should be questioning ourselves about how open to new ideas are we? Or when somebody comes up with a new idea, are we going to say, oh yeah, 5 years ago we tried that, it was a disaster, it never worked, great reason not to try anything new ever again. Because the other characteristic of a disruptor is they fail spectacularly and often. There's loads of examples of people who you would probably say are in that disruptor category. Some of them have failed several times. but they've always bounced back because they're so determined that their thought processes are correct, they can make a difference, they can create a new business model, that actually the rest of it is irrelevant. So, tricky characteristics, interesting ones, rarities, but again, not an excuse for us not to do anything with those. So, personal challenge. Could you change your business model in wherever you work in your organisations to move from an input-based approach to one of outputs? So to be very specific, I spent 10 years in consultancy living on my wits because I was paid by results. So when we went for a contract, my remuneration was directly linked to the results that delivered for the organisation. That's why I have grey hair. It was really edgy. When I started a family, I decided that probably wasn't a great place for me to be. But the money was great, but it was real risk-taking stuff because to enter a contract with somebody where you're going to be paid by making a difference to them is really quite difficult because you're relying on so many things. Their ability to understand what they need, their ability to recognise what they have, their ability to articulate the business case for something. And this is where some of my cynicism creeps in, that most of us don't actually know what we need until we see it. So somebody somewhere has to have put this thing together. I can take a look at it and think, actually, yeah, that's what I want. But still, quite many times we insist on saying to people, now, what would you like? What do you need to run your trials more effectively? They don't know, most of the time. Better put that one in for legal purposes. But if I say to somebody, actually, we've looked at your clinical trials, we can see that the rate of non-screening, non-enrolling sites is X over a period of 6 months, we can see the ratio of adverse events, etc., etc. We should go to our internal customers and give them these metrics and say, so we can see this is a problem, do you agree? So here's some things we can do about it. So we're going to them with a mostly crafted solution to something rather than a blank sheet. If we do that, we're educating our internal clients about their current state, potential future state, what they could have, and that's not to say we're going to be right. But you've got to maybe 60% of the solution before you start inviting people in for that conversation. You can say, this is what you can have. And I liken it in part to buying a house. So I moved house about 4 years ago, and I lived in a very old house, beautiful to look at if you weren't paying for it. Inside, you'd put a screw in a wall to hang a picture up and you'd cause about £50,000 worth of damage behind the scenes without even realising it. So when we went to move, we said, we like an old house still. The estate agent said to us, I bet you end up getting something completely different. So we went from a house that was built in 1800 to a house that was built in about 10 years ago. So completely different, because we thought we wanted something, but then we started looking, we realised actually it wasn't quite what we wanted. And that's where we are in our organisations with our clients. So if you think about moving to an output-based approach, so any kind of initiatives we drive in the organisation, it's not about we're going to invest X million in this piece of kit that's going to do these things. It's actually we are going to reduce the rate of non-screening, non-enrolling sites by 10% over a period of... Now I can feel you all thinking, difficult, really difficult to do, but possible. But there's a big cultural change that's needed. It's about educating our internal clients. It's about being more of a consultant within the organisation, going to our internal clients with a clear articulation of what the issues are that they face. Sometimes put in a way they don't even realise themselves. They've never looked at it that way. So imagine if you got paid on the basis of the results that you produce for your organisation. Scary, scary thought, but actually really interesting too. So we've got luxury. We're probably not going to be in that position for some time. So why not start thinking about that now? How can we demonstrate that what we have just done is going to actually impact on the efficiency of our clinical trials and the results on patients? If you think about it that way, I bet you a lot of projects would disappear off the radar because somebody somewhere thought it would be a great idea if we did this thing. We go out and buy a shiny toy, but it's not actually going to address the problem. So articulating the business case becomes much, much more effective when you start thinking about what outcomes are we going to drive do this particular initiative. So if I don't see any of you in the future, I know that didn't work out either. And there's a couple of things around this. So the disruptive model, or a version of this, I think it's came from McKinsey, looks at cost value, experience value, and platform value. It's a really interesting way of looking at this. So the first thing, I'm thinking about outcomes. So what is it we need to do? We need to drive down the metric for something, or drive up the metric for something, or probably a collection of those. So what's the cost value of actually doing this? So it's going to cost us X amount of time and money to be able to do this. Then what experience is it going to deliver for our end users? And I'm a really big believer, based on some of my past experience, that the experience of information consumption at work should be as good as or better than it is at home. Now that's quite some distance to travel in many of our organisations. So I'm based in the UK. This morning I had a text message from my bank saying that this money had come in and out, etc., etc. The utility companies sent me a message. I got a whole load of messages this morning about stuff that's going on in my personal infrastructure. I didn't have to go out and look for it or ask somebody where to find it. It found me. And I think there's a lot of room for a different user experience within individual systems environments, but also across the whole customer journey. There's a massive area for improvement there. So I come to work, I work from home, I switch on my devices, that's my portal, that's my world. Information's pushed to me at the right time, depending on where I am in the business process. It's a much more intuitive thing. So if we're going to enable that, you may already have done that in your organisations, great. So we're being a bit disruptive because we're actually helping people to be much more intuitive about their data and information consumption. And the last piece is the platform. So again, if I'm thinking about outcomes, I've got a set of outcomes in mind. But actually there's probably a strong possibility that what I expected would happen changes into something else. So there's often unrealised value that occurs somewhere in the system. So a quick confession. I think a lot of the early .com work that I did, the customer segments who we anticipated would be the key consumers for this thing, music, media, whatever it was, often was incorrect. We had some amazing results of customer groups I'd never even thought about who were using this particular space. We got it wrong. That's okay. We're making assumptions, we're testing those assumptions, and so on and so forth. So whatever we do next could actually allow more things to happen that we haven't even thought possible. So when we're thinking about being outcome-based or output-based, we don't really know where this is going to go. So we could focus on one metric, which is really important to the business, and focus on that, but we should be setting things up so that other things can come off it. So greater insight. So it's really interesting, Glenn was talking about machine learning this morning. You know, what other stuff could we find in there that we hadn't actually anticipated? So there's huge depths of exploration to be taken here. So I really like this model. I didn't pay for it, which is probably why I like it. But you know, this whole thing about the different types of experience, though, the cost experience, the customer or user experience, and finally, the platform experience, a really good way to look at this. So what could we possibly enable that we don't even know about yet? And how are we going to try and make sure that we capture that a bit later on? So I appreciate this is a big ask. This is a theoretical concept because you're in the room and you're getting paid by your employer based on what you're doing at the moment. But just think about this. Outcomes-based, outputs. Based on what you're working on at the moment, if you change that language and change that thinking, what result do you get to? And in many cases, it would be a question mark. And I said to you earlier, I've only been at Roche for 4 years, which does qualify me as being a new boy. And I've only been in the OTI for about 2 months. I spent a lot of time in the early days when I joined Roche saying, sorry, why are we doing this? Could you just explain to me why we're doing this? Not that it was wrong, I hasten to say. But I just didn't quite understand why we were doing certain things in a certain way. Again, it's not to say they were wrong, just in case this gets webcast later. But you know, you have to always ask that question. Why are we doing this exactly? Just to make sure there is an answer that actually stacks up. So, 2 more things before I run out of time. Operational data, I think, is a key to much of this. And again, I really enjoyed the sort of machine learning piece this morning because I think that's really, really important. The more we mine our own data from an operational perspective, the more things we can discover. And it's that discovery piece that will lead us into much better outcomes for our organisations. But a lot of stuff needs to happen. So, you know, there's a general rule of thumb that you spend, I don't know, 80% of your time cleaning data before you can apply any kind of intelligence to it whatsoever, including human. So there's a big job for us to do. But I think operational data is the key to much of this mining, so we can apply big data principles to it and see what we can find that people in business don't even realise is there, perhaps. Or maybe we don't even realise is there. And the other key thing is to start small. So I've already mentioned that many well-known disruptors and also entrepreneurs have failed many, many times, some of them, and spectacularly. Sometimes wonder, how on earth did you get the money to do this again when it went so badly wrong the first time? But they do. So the other thing we need to do in terms of our mindset is be prepared to start small, experiment, be happy to fail. We always talk about, fail early, fail often, etc., but nobody actually means it. Do you want to stand up in front of your leadership team and say, sorry, we just spent $500,000 and it was a waste of time. Big move, but interesting, because what have we learned from that experiment that we could pull further on? So I'm a big fan of small bursts of experimentation, just to see what happens. And I also, as I said before, don't want to start with a blank page. I don't want to ask the business what they want. I want to say, based on the data, this is what we can see. So why don't we experiment with this and see where we can push it and just see what happens? Low risk, low cost. Because one of the other things I would say is that we are in such a highly regulated environment that taking risks is not something that comes naturally to many people. I mentioned this a while ago. Actually, Christian was at this talk I did. People were jumping up and down saying, we don't mind taking risks. I was thinking, yeah, but you don't want to take risks. You've just said that. So you're pretending, or you're being offended by me saying you don't want to take risks. But we're not in that kind of environment. We don't want people to take risks. We want them to follow a process so we can make sure the patients are safe and we follow all the rules. So getting people to take risks in that kind of environment is a bit of a tricky one. So starting small is less of a risk. So let me just experiment with this thing. Let me play with the data. Let me just see what comes out of it and what we could see that's different and new. And the final piece is around a concept called Skunkworks. As with most things, it's a great principle, but there's some tricky bits around it. But the general principles of Skunkworks, it came from aviation. I think it was Lockheed Martin, who recruited a bunch of people from outside the business, kept them at complete arm's length and said, reinvent aircraft. And they came up with some amazing results. Now, one of the challenges with this is that you need to have an abrasive dynamic for this to work. So, if in your own organisation you went out and recruited a whole load of new people, that's not going to work. They're not connected with the business or an understanding of what's gone before, any kind of principles around that, and then come up with some mad stuff. And when I worked with artists and creative types and musicians years ago, some of these guys were just off the wall, completely. So if you put them in a room and said, reimagine a clinical trial, they probably said it to music or something, but it wouldn't be necessarily usable. But how about if you get some hand-picked people from the business who've got some quite negative opinions of how we do stuff? I want all those kind of the moaners, the complainers, always complaining about what we do. Okay, time to put up, or shut up, come and join the party. So a combination of outsiders with some pretty wacky ideas, some insiders who are known for their opposing views of how we work, and some people who love the way we do things. Put them into a Skunkworks project and say, we want you to reimagine the way that we work. So it's thinking about the value. Where does the value come from? From a clinical trial. And nothing is off limits. Let them play with that. We'd end up with some stuff that was probably not at all usable. But equally, we'd end up with some good stuff that we think, actually, if we're bold enough, if we are willing to experiment on a small scale, if we're willing to take a risk, we might be able to go somewhere with this. So, key things for me today are that personal change is incredibly difficult, organisational change is very difficult, but not impossible. And for disruption, I haven't suggested at all in this session that our organisations are going to disappear anytime soon. However, I am suggesting that the winds of change are really getting louder and stronger, and we as internal employees and our organisations responsible for technology and data and information need to consider changing the way that we do things so we can make sure we are in the right position to support our organisations with the right data that they need in the future. And to be thinking about what is the business model. Is the business model about selling drugs to patients? Or is this business model all about the data? Or is it about selling more drugs at a lower cost to more people? Et cetera, et cetera. It's a whole range of things to think about, but that, I think, requires a fundamental shift in the way that we organise ourselves and the way that we think. And I think that we should be disruptive as far as we can in terms of our own thought process and within our own organisations without getting fired. Thank you very much.